Hey friends, welcome to the show. We are so excited to have you guys joining us here at the Simplified Church podcast. And I got to tell you, I'm very conflicted about today's episode, and for a couple reasons. One, because on one side of it, this is exactly what we're here to do. Like, we are in the next half hour together over the next 2 weeks. We're going to be sitting in the sweet spot of what it is that we're here to do as an organization, where we want to help pastors outsource the overwhelm. We want to equip guys that are in the trenches of ministry. We want to get into the space of everyday pastors and ministers and church leaders and be a source of encouragement, a source of hope. We want to link arms with you, right? So there's that side of it. But there are times where we get so excited about this space that we're going to enter into that we recognize there's a tension, and that tension is some of the conversations we have to have in order to be able to be real, in order to be able to be authentic, in order to be able to link arms with you. And so that's where we're going to be. And so I'm pumped to lay out for you guys, not just this week's episode, but this is going to be a 2-part episode journey for us, where we're going to be getting into one of the most difficult, painful, just life-changing conversations that is really so unique to ministry. And that if you've ever experienced this, or if you know someone, or you're doing life, or you have a relative or a friend or somebody you went to seminary with that has experienced this, it has radically impacted them. And in some cases, it's even gone so far to really have a detrimental impact on their faith. And so we're going to be living in this tension of, man, I'm excited that we get to have this conversation, but it's just going to be a really difficult one. But one, I promise you, gang, I promise you, if you hang with us over the next couple of weeks as we jump into this, you're going to be blessed. I just beyond measure. So we're going to be talking about this idea of the wounded pastor. So what happens when you're in ministry and you deal with and are faced with an unjustifiable termination or a forced resignation? What do you do when your whole life, your whole ministry, your whole community is now rocked away from you? What do you do? And this conversation is going to be really, really important. And to get into this conversation today, I got two great guys. One is, of course, he's the rock star. He's the Mick Jagger. He's the John Lennon of the show, is my man, Greg. What's up, Greg?
Not much, Mike. How are you, my friend?
Good. Are you enjoying these little comparisons I've been making?
Yes, but like, there are lots of other places I would go than those two particular comparisons. But
I appreciate the 2 greatest rock bands of all time.
Well, yeah, but
where would you go to? What do you want to be? The guy that started Cracker Barrel? Is that the guy you want to be compared to?
Hey, we're not going down the Cracker Barrel rabbit hole again today. No.
We love our Cracker Barrel on this show, man.
We did that last week.
Sponsorship, baby.
We did that last week.
No, I'm trying to get one of them little peg games. You know, you're an imbecile. I don't need a game to tell me that. Okay, I had parents. Okay, I already know I'm dumb. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need a game to tell me that. But you are okay. So you don't like the John Lennon and Mick Jagger comparison?
No, I do.
Jimmy Buffett. You're the Jimmy Buffett of the show.
All right. It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere, baby. Woo! You doing good, man? How you holding up?
I'm good, my friend. How are you?
I'm well. I'm actually very well today. I'm really, I'm almost anxious about this conversation because this is the stuff, man, that, like, this is what we've been pining for, what we've been hoping to do, you know?
It is. And as we were kind of getting things squared away to get started today, in my office above my desk, I have, my ordination papers and a few other things. Cause when I was a youth guy starting out, I didn't have anything to hang on the walls. So I still hang those on the walls.
Birth certificate.
That's right. Yeah. But looking back at some of the guys who were instrumental in those early days, there are several names on that list that aren't in ministry anymore. Wow. Some from self-inflicted wounds, but many from the wounds of churches. And so I think it's real, and something that pastors and church leaders have to begin to have conversations about, and then begin to say, okay, so what are the solutions? How do we ensure that we're not known for eating our own? And I'm afraid that far too many, that's exactly what we're known for, is that we just will turn on those who are of us, and just ruin them, because stuff gets hard.
Yeah, man.
And so I'm excited about getting to have this conversation. I wish that it wasn't one that we needed to have,
right?
But I think it's absolutely one that we need to have. And so I'm super excited, man. I don't know, like, it's already a good day because there are 3 balded or beautiful bearded men, 2 of which are bald. I mean, how could it get better than that? I mean, great radio for me to describe to you the appearance of the guys sitting around the table this afternoon.
Well, and that was a beautiful. You talk about beautiful. That was a beautiful introduction to Dr. Matthew Tanner, who, if he wasn't insecure about his hairline, he is now. Okay, so he is from now on. But Dr. Tanner, dude, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for bringing this important conversation to the forefront. And I'll be honest, man, before we even be like, I'll let you speak, I promise. But I'm just, I'm itching at this. I got to tell you, there's nothing like this. I've looked, and I've wanted it for years, as I have done life with guys who have just sat in the wake and the trauma of dealing with unjustifiable terminations, forced resignations, having their lives stripped from them, and there's not been this cohesive voice crying out from the wilderness until you. And so I really, really appreciate this work. I appreciate this book that you've written, and I'm so thankful to have you on. So, man, on behalf of Greg and I and the whole Simplify family, thanks for coming on the show today, brother. Appreciate you.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for the platform to be able to get the message out and help guys like me. You know, that as I was going through this, I too found there was nothing out there that was a comprehensive, cohesive plan, something that I could sink my teeth into to get some sort of help and try to heal from this. And just trying to get the word out that healing can take place when you've been through something like this.
Man, and we're gonna get into all of that too. So, what you have to know, gang, as you're listening today, and hopefully coming back next week for part 2, Dr. Tanner has written this book, The Wounded Pastor. It's a healing strategy for unjustifiable termination and forced resignation. And we're going to tell you how you get that book, and we're going to tell you all the places you can connect with him and get more information. But this book is so important that I think every pastor needs to have it. I remember when I was going through seminary, and before I graduated, there was a guy kind of on staff at the seminary. He'd written this thing called the Minister's Manual, and it was just a small little book, but inside of it had all of these examples of how you do ordinations, how you do baptisms, how you do funerals, how you do weddings, all these little examples. And they gave it to all of the guys that were finishing up seminary. And I've used it for 20 years. I've used it. It's just every wedding I've ever done, every funeral I've ever done, anything I've ever, special prayer services, anything like that. Those kind of big, stalwart moments in ministry that you're like, man, I really wish I had a field guide. Your book needs to be handed to every guy before he graduates seminary, as far as I'm concerned, because you just never know when you're going to find yourself on the wrong end of a really bad set of circumstances. So, man, as we get into this, I don't want to give away all the details in the book because I want people to buy it. I want people to buy this book like crazy. Okay. I want to see you get that boat out the Lake of the Ozarks. You know what I mean? Like, I want to see you hooked up, bro, because I'd love to come out and do some fishing with you. But
absolutely.
What I'd love to know in part 1 of this conversation around the Wounded Pastor is give us the journey. How did you arrive at this place to create this work?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember sitting through seminary, and again, I received the same manual, and they would talk to us about kind of introduce the dangers of being a pastor. And I remember very distinctly them telling us that within 10 years of graduating seminary, 50% of those of us sitting in that room would no longer be in ministry.
Wow.
And I can look back, just like Greg said earlier before we went live, there are people that names that we know that are casualties of this war, that have no longer been in ministry. And I remember sitting back in that situation wondering, well, what are we supposed to do about that? Why are we just okay that number is just going to happen? So I kind of started that direction even from seminary, and then went into my first church. My first church was kind of a split waiting to happen, two distinct groups. I was just as green as I could be. And I had the audacity to try to, teach the Bible and just kind of get that middle ground of, let's get a common vision. The church ended up splitting after I got there. I distinctly remember the patriarch of the church beating me to church on one Wednesday night. And I knew if he was there before I was, then there was a problem. And so I walked in and asked, hey, how you doing? Did all the conversation. And the only thing he said is, are you putting out resumes? And so that was my first church. My second church was a pastor mill. I was number 5 in a row that they had forced out. I'd never experienced that in my life before, but I went thinking, God's going to change this. I'm going to be the one to break the cycle, all those things we tell ourselves. And within about a year and a half to 2 years, I was kicked out. So I kind of chalked that up to, okay, I got my scars, got my wounds. I've been through it. They said everybody's going to go through it once in their ministry. Check the box. The next one's going to be better. I was a director of missions for a while. Felt the call back into the pulpit, went back into pastoring a church, and found myself going through this forced resignation again. In fact, I made one individual in the church, she began to be upset at me within, I think, just a few months of being there over some biblical teaching. And of course, I've been deemed a heretic in a church. I've had verse in 2 Peter used against me. Apparently, hellfire and all that's going to rain down on me at any moment, things of that nature. And I'll share a little bit later, deeper into that story as we go. But I found myself forced out yet again. And I looked for help. I looked for mentors to help. I looked for a book that I could read. I looked for anything to help me get through the pain and the suffering of what I had been through. And I found absolutely nothing. And at the same time I was going through this, I was doing my doctorate through Midwestern Seminary. And I was looking for a project. And I just finally decided, it was the Lord basically told me, if you can't find anything, then tell your story and you be the one to write a strategy to help these guys heal. So when I was looking for something to help me survive the pain and suffering of this, I just started diving into it and studying it. And if there's nothing going to be out there, then I'm going to write something that helps guys out. So that's kind of what led to this project.
Wow. That's incredible. That's just a lot to process.
It is a lot.
That's truly incredible. Greg, what are you thinking?
So the first question that I'm thinking is, when you presented that concept to your advisor, what that conversation look like?
Oh, that's a great question.
As soon as I went to my advisor and I said, this is what my project is going to be, his first words were, absolutely, this is going to be a painful project, but it has to be done. So that was his response to this idea.
Okay.
So it was very positive from the very beginning. And when I was sitting in colloquium class, when we were all going around the room sharing our projects, all the guys were sharing what their project was going to be, what they were going to study. And I shared mine, and the room just went completely quiet.
Yeah.
And finally somebody said, when that turns into a book, can you call me? I want to read it. I mean, that was the first thing out of their mouth was, this has got to happen. Because other guys had found themselves in the same situation, and everybody to a person said, I've never seen this done. I've never read anything about this. But everybody knows it's happening, but is afraid to admit that it's happening. And that's a whole nother level of it. It's kind of, I hate the term whistleblowing, but it's a little bit of blowing the whistle of saying, guys, we've got to stop ignoring the fact that this is happening and that we're really turning a blind eye to it. And really the 4 to 7% per year per evangelical denomination, we've just turned this into it's acceptable losses, and we're okay with that amount of people, those amount of pastors being pushed out. And we've got to stop being okay with it. So the mindset every time I've shared it was, man, I can't wait to see this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what we see of how the church is becoming more and more corporate in that particular mindset of, okay, what is the acceptable loss here? What will we be okay with? And not only in this area, but in other areas. And so how did you begin this process as you were working it out and say, okay, this is not acceptable, and so we got to have a solution to it? What did that begin to look like? How did you begin to build this this project out to allow for you to then develop the strategy that comes out of it?
That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember during my research, in fact, when I found there was one article that I found, and when I found it, I literally ran through the house sharing with my wife and my children, which my children were like, "Yay, Dad, that's great." But I remember running through the house because I found that golden piece, and it was an article in a psychology journal that interviewed 8 couples that have been through this. And it proved that my study method that I started with was the right study method. And from that, I determined that I was going to interview as many pastors as I could and just have them share their story. In fact, in the book, I detailed the exact questions that I asked these pastors. And I began to hear and write down and receive all of the stories. And I believe there was about 30 pastors that I talked to through this. And really the strategy developed out of the stories. And the big research word is a phenomenological study. And that's where you simply tell the story, and then the data is mined out of the story instead of just a quantitative data where you just go do a bunch of surveys and then find out what they say. So I began to just listen. This may sound a little bit weird, but I listened to my own story. I began to view it really as much as I could apart from my own story. And through listening to the stories, I began to notice the categories that needed healing the most. And that's where I came up with the levels of strategy at the end of the book, or the bulk of the book. And that is, the building of the house illustration that I use. It's the economic strategy, emotional healing, spiritual healing, and then leadership development. So it came out of just being real and understanding the story, diving into it, hearing the heartbreaks and the stories of those other men that have been through it. And through that, the strategy really developed on its own.
Okay. So I love hearing this, and I love hearing how you were guided by your journey, but not just your journey. You were guided by the stories of several others. And to your point, Matthew, there is a massive segment of guys. Like, there are guys that I know that you don't know, and there's guys that you know that I don't know, but we all know someone who's gone through something like this. And so it seems like it's probably a far deeper issue than just what's at the surface. But if I could play devil's advocate a little bit here, just for the sake of clarity, but also so that we can make sure that we're speaking the same language. You say unjustifiable termination and forced resignation. Okay. What qualifies as an unjustifiable termination and forced resignation? I mean, can it just be that at the end of the day that It's competing visions. It's a clash of personality. It's not a good fit culturally. And then some guys take it personally like that and then blow it out of proportion. Is that possible?
Yeah, that's entirely possible. But I don't mind giving this away. What I put in the book, there's actually 4 different categories. There's justified termination, unjustified termination, no termination, and then mutual termination. And a few of those things that you just mentioned really actually find its way into mutual termination, where it just culture doesn't fit and could be toxic leadership or something like that. And what happens is just a mutual separating of like, this is just not working. The other category with justified termination is there is a moral or ethical failure that has actually happened, and the pastor needs to be terminated because he has sinned. There's a biblical mandate that has been defied here. The unjustified termination is, and the reasons that are given are just about any reason they can come up with. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It's more of they just don't like, you hear people say, well, you're reaching the wrong people, or we just don't like what you taught in scripture. Or I had one time a deacon's wife tell me on a Sunday morning, you preach about sin too much. You should wait and preach on sin on Sunday nights, which I naively told her, well, you don't come on Sunday nights. And that went over about as well as you can expect it did.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was great. That went over really well.
Yeah, well, I think it's funny, but
I'll see myself out. Thank you.
Yeah. Right? It's like, okay, I'm going to go home now.
Yeah,
but it's taking minor flaws and turning them into fatal flaws. And it's the fact that they do not want to follow God's vision for the church, or they do not want biblical teaching, or they just don't want to give up control that is not biblically theirs. All of these different reasons that put it into this unjustifiable category. I try in the book to very carefully steer it away from those things of it's more than just a culture issue, or it just wasn't a good fit. They just don't want to follow God's word, or they don't want to follow God's vision, and they don't want to follow biblical pastoral leadership. And so they find any way they can to get rid of the pastor, because they can always just go get another pastor rather than do what God's called them to do.
Mm. Well, and sometimes it seems like it shakes out. So I'm the second chair leader at our place, and sometimes it first starts with the second chair leader. If I can get that guy out, then either perhaps I can wear down the other, or before I can get the guy out that I really want to be gone, I've got to get rid of his support system. So let's go after the youth guy. Let's go after the music guy. Let's go after the, whoever. But I still think that there are still some of those same moments when it's, okay, you can go back and you can say, okay, there's nothing that I've done that should be this big of a deal. Mm-hmm. But here we are. And yeah, we all know guys who have been there or have been there ourselves. And so how do you begin to then walk out we've got the unjustified piece of this. How do you walk out and describe that kind of forced resignation? Because in my experience, that's been heavily on, well, they just won't follow me, or they just, we're just too different. So help me understand how you categorize that, since we've got the idea of unjust termination. Now, what's that kind of forced resignation piece look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I distinguish the two, because there's these two distinguishing phenomenons that are happening. The unjustified termination, in fact, there's a quote in the book that, you show up at the deacons meeting and they basically say, you're by the next business meeting, you will be fired. And there's the vote that takes place and they're out. So that's one category. That's the unjustified termination. The forced resignation is where I use the term a mobbing effect. It's where they begin to make life so difficult for the pastor or for his family or for his support group that they just absolutely wear you down to the point where it becomes easier to resign than it is to live like this any further. Or they begin to do the threatening, if you don't resign, then we will fire you. And so what happens is the pastor, in order to really be getting in a better negotiating position, if I can negotiate a severance or make life easier on my family, then I'll just walk away. One church that I was pastoring, I share this illustration. They really, it was just attack after attack. It was just wearing you down. And then I had a deacon in the church start a rumor in the community that I had been unfaithful to my wife and named names of the couple, knowing it was not true, knowing it was easily verified that it was not true. I had 10 people that wrote letters saying there's no way this could be true. It was absolutely undeniably no way it could be true. Yet he didn't care. He just knew it would be strong enough to put enough pressure to go, look, if you're going to resort to that, I'm out. And so that's what the forced resignation is they just wear you down over time or make it clear either you resign or we're going to fire you, so that really the pastor just gets so worn down, it's easier just to give up and walk away than it is to continue to fight a losing battle. So that's the distinct difference between the two.
Okay. Let me ask you, just in general, what are your thoughts on when, in order for a pastor to receive a severance, and, whether it's, specifically kind of an unjustified or a forced resignation in those instances, what are your general thoughts on an NDA? If you know what I'm talking about, that non-disclosure agreement that especially you see, and I don't want to pigeonhole in a negative way, but in my personal experience, what I've seen is in larger churches in particular like to do the NDAs because of the fallout that can come. What are your thoughts on that, Matthew?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it's not something that I really cover in detail in the book. I'm thinking back on the ones that I interviewed, and probably out of the 30, there was only about 2 or 3 that talked about an NDA. And there was actually one that I just still to this day would not get his name because of that very reason. I think you're correct. It's more a larger church issue, or if somebody within the church or within the negative side of the leadership, the leadership in the wrong, has some experience with that. Personally, I think it's harmful to the pastor because it's going to keep them from being able to get some of the help that they need. And I think that's why the churches do it, because, it may be a controversial statement, but a lot of times the NDA is written to benefit one party or the other. It's heavily weighted to one side. And so the church that's going to ask for that it's going to greatly benefit the church. And the way they use it is, we can do anything we want. We can force you to resign. We can do all of these things. We can go talk into the community. We can keep you from finding another position, but you can't do anything about it and you can't speak about it. So personal opinion as a pastor, I would not recommend signing one of those. If a church is putting that up at the beginning, then that's going to be a red flag to me that they've had issues with this. And I'm going to be very careful with that church, to be quite honest.
Yeah, that's good.
That might give me some interesting comments, but I just think they're dangerous, honestly.
Yeah, I'm curious if the phenomenon that you've experienced, that you studied, and we all know, like, even without it having connections with each other before all of this, we've all heard the horror stories. We know it.
Absolutely.
I know guys personally that have gone through this. What do you think is the driving factor behind this? Why is this happening in churches? And why does it seem like it continues to be a larger problem? Like it's growing, like it's a beast that's being fed. Do you have any idea, any thought, any speculation as to what's like driving this? Is it the corporate stuff like Greg's talking about, the influence of corporate America? And so, we treat it like business, or is there something more happening here? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it somewhat is, it's somewhat the business mindset, and it's where we have to understand business principles are good to use, but the church is not a business. And we begin to treat it as such. Partially, it goes back to denominations, I would say, are turning a blind eye to it. I reached out through this to certain denominations, and every one of them said, "Hey, this is a great project, great plan. We just don't want to partner with it." I think it goes back to the acceptable loss issue. Where does the support come from? It comes from the church, not from the pastor. A lot of those different factors. It is hard to come up with any single reason. I think you can take a global step back and say it's just the sign of the times. The closer we get to the end times, not to dive into that category or that discussion or make it about that.
Sure.
But the closer we get to the Lord coming back, it's going to be harder to do church. I mean, the Bible's clear about that. So I think some of that factors into it. I think, to be quite transparent, I think it goes back to a history of pastors. Let's take the log out of our own eye. And over the years, pastors, the average tenure of a pastor is 18 months, and we can't put all of that on just the church. The pastor not staying and fighting battles, not staying in a culture long enough, climbing the ladder, we've made success as a pastor, instead of it being obedience to God's call and obedience to where he's placed you, we've made it bigger and better. Get the bigger and better. So the pastor has to look, or pastors across the board, we have to look at our own selves and say, we've created the soil, if you were, a little bit for this phenomenon to take place. When pastors are absconding their position and their leadership and authority and just moving on, or for whatever reason, in the void of leadership, let me say it this way, if there is a void of leadership, other leadership will step up to take its place. And so it's created this culture in our churches where the wrong leadership has taken place. When you see pastors come and go, well, then the leadership has turned to the church members or to the deacons, or we've created this unbiblical model of church. And the first step is admitting that this is a problem, it's happening, helping the pastors heal. And going back to something Greg said earlier, about when I started sharing this project, the first thing they said was, when can I get my hands on it? But all the way through this project, people have asked me, well, when are you going to write something about the church's perspective, or how the churches can heal from this pastor turnover? How can you stop it from that side? So,
wow.
The reasons are, is legion as you can come up with.
Sure.
But it's denominational blindness. It's pastoral absconding of leadership. It's we've created this culture of leadership in our churches that is unbiblical. We've got to get back to that. All of these things kind of factor in that have created the fertile ground for this phenomenon to take place. And like I said, best I can tell through my research, it's happening 4 to 7% per year per evangelical denomination, and it is growing.
So a couple of things that stick out to me, and I'd be interested to know if you have an answer to it. First question is, when did this become normal? Like, is this something that shifted when the church model shifted to a much more pastor as CEO? Like, is that when we saw this becoming more and more prevalent? Or, has it just always been, but we're just talking about it more and more aware of what's going on? Any kind of insight there as you've walked this out and studied the numbers?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's kind of exactly where I want to go with the book, focusing on the church of when did this start, looking at the history of it, and I was limited in my scope of being able to dive into that. I think it's a little bit of a both and. If I can take the cop out middle ground on that question,
Sure.
I think to a degree it's been happening for many years. It's been happening ever since and I'm probably using this term wrong, the invention of the congregational polity that we enjoy. I think early on, the autonomy of the local church was created for the right reasons, but just like everything else, it becomes adulterated the longer it goes. It's not autonomy of the local church. It doesn't act and mean what it did when it was created to protect the church. Things of that nature. So I think somewhere back in history, as the autonomy of the church started to mean something different, as pastors began to be CEOs, as we began to define success rather than biblical obedience, we began to define success as numbers, things like that. I think that's when it created this fertile ground for this phenomenon to happen. And I think if you were able to chart it, as those things changed in the church, in the polity and the evangelical church, you begin to see the rise of this phenomenon. And it's just going to get worse until we start doing something about it, both at the pastoral level, but also at the church level.
Sure. So here's a follow-up to it. Did you find, or have you found that this is a larger problem in single pastoral staff churches as opposed to churches that have, a plurality of elders where there's that support system? Like, is it even in those realms? Is it higher? Is it lower? What did you find there?
Yeah, and I'm going to make a little bit of a distinction. Where there is a plurality of elders, and again, that can be for that topic, whether you should have elders or not, can be for a different podcast. But the where there's that plurality of co-shepherds of that equal standing, I don't believe you see this phenomenon as much. Now, with that said, according to my research, size of church, length of ministry, number of staff, things of that nature absolutely do not factor in about whether one's happening more or less. It's actually even across the board in all of those factors of how much this is happening. Length of service, it's not a rookie pastor problem. All of those things, it happens to support staff or associate staff, lead staff, lead pastors, churches of 20 or 30, all the way up to churches of thousands. So it's happening evenly across the board in all those factors.
Man, it's a heartbreaking reality.
It really is,
and I think I really appreciate that. While hey, this book is written for pastors that have been wounded by a very broken system and a flawed way of thinking. You're not afraid to call out some of the groundwork that's been laid by pastors to create this terrible environment. And I really respect that. And I appreciate that. And I think, that follow-up book from the perspective of the church, you should write that book. Because I think it'd be really helpful, especially in trying to reignite a conversation. I think as I'm listening to you and as I'm trying to filter that through my own perspective, the impact of Western culture, particularly American Western culture, on the church is so obvious in so many places. But in my opinion, it's no more prevalent than in our understanding and implementation of leadership structures and church governance.
Mm.
And this idea of we have constitutions and we have voting rights for our members and we have these, business style leadership structures. Man, I just think that's so unhealthy. And I know that, like, in my Reformed Baptist background, that makes me a black sheep because I don't support that. I don't support those things because I don't think that they're necessarily biblical, and I don't think they're necessarily helpful. I think what they do is they create opportunities for people to politic and be subversive and use systems to remove people. Why do I know that? And why do I think that? Because that's what you see in America. So like, I just see these things happening all the time. But I love that you're willing to try to engage the conversation on both ends so that healing can actually take place and growth can take place. And I think that's so important. Man, I love the conversation that we've began here today. And I realize that there's so much more to be said, and we're not going to say it all. But that's why, we want people to buy your book.
Absolutely.
Because, the whole point of this is just to bring people into the conversation, pull back the curtain and say, look, this is a real phenomenon. This is a real issue. It's happening. It's happened to you, pastor, as you're listening. It's happened to your cousin, your brother, your uncle, your dad. It's happened to someone you grew up with that you really trusted and you cared for, and you watched their life get ripped out from under them. The repercussion of this is just, it's insane. So we know it's a real problem, but we're just trying to help really create the dialogue so that pastors can get the help that they need. And that's what we're going to be talking about when we come back for part 2 next week. We're going to be getting into this idea that Dr. Tanner, you've given us some strategies to implement so that healing can begin. So we don't get stuck in the mire of the problem, but rather grab the rope and start pulling ourselves out by the grace of God, the goodness of the Holy Spirit, and implementing some strategies. And so we're going to be talking about what are the benefits of those strategies and what does it look like on the other side? Amen. What does it look like when healing is happening? And so, man, I can't wait to get into that. Listen, make sure you guys come back for part 2. You're not going to want to miss that. But just real quick, Matthew, where can people connect with you if they want to get more information about you and the work that you're doing right here in the Wounded Pastor?
Absolutely. Yeah. The best way to get in contact with me is I'll give you my website. It's woundedleadership.com. On that, you can get some information about me. You can contact me for if you wanted speaking engagements, things like that, conferences. You can purchase the book on the website. There's more coming on the website every day. So the best way to get a hold of me and find information about the book, woundedleadership.com. And of course, you can find the book on barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com and other booksellers.
Absolutely, man. And we're going to have a link on our website as well. So simplifychurch.com/podcast. You'll see a link there where you can pick up the book, and you'll be able to find also a link where you can head over to part 2 and join us for that. But thanks for listening, gang. Come back for part 2. You're not going to want to miss this conversation.